I just wanted to start off by saying that this talk has gone through a few evolutions. Initially, it was going to be an economics talk, but took care of that last week brilliantly, I should say. Um, and so, one of the things I wanted to discuss in this was, in addition to the economic stuff, also the social stuff that follows from that, because there's often um, a division in people's minds, whether they're pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist or what, about Marxists and their take on politics and economics. Um, uh, for on the large scales, you could see the division in like the Stalinist and Maoist states, where they have lots of talk about liberation and equality, while having vast gulags and concentration camps, state-controlled unions, and over-policed workforces. Social democrats, like in Europe, often discuss reforms for some workers while supporting imperialism, immigration controls, and things like that. Um, And in the US, recently, we've seen a lot of socialist leaning types who have expressed the sentiment that the culture war, in quotes, is a distraction from the real class war. Um, and even among some revolutionaries, there's often lots of excitement for the social stuff, the history, the revolution, the things like that. But then when it comes to discussing economics, the eyes begin to glaze over, and people reach for the nearest bong or something like that. Um, what I wanted to do today is discuss the relationship between those two. That it's not an accident, it's not coincidental that we have these ideas. So I want to build on Anaga's talk and on Roddy's a few weeks before that on what is a worker, to discuss how Marx and Marxists look, or at least should look at capital. Um, why Marxists don't actually consider capitalism a purely economic system, but a social totality, and why understanding it requires linking our economic liberation, our ideas about economic liberation, with our ideas about social liberation. So, what's capital? Your standard intro to economics in high school or whatever will be all about things. People will think, when you think about capital, most people think machines, offices, and things like that. Things that can be used to make a profit, to run a business, and things like that. Um, but even bosses, even the capitalist system will recognize that it's not just a thing, right? The computer I'm giving this talk on, for me, is not capital, but for a business, would be capital. Right. So even capitalists recognize that it's not really a thing, even though they talk about it as a thing. Marx's method is different. Um, in the opening chapters of his famous work, Capital, he breaks down a commodity, what a commodity is, and talks about having a use value, but also an exchange value, and that it isn't the exchange value, but the exchange value is embedded in it. He does the same with capital, right? He says at another in another work, a cotton spinning machine is just a cotton spinning machine. Only in certain circumstances does it become capital. Capital is a social relation of production. So that's how Marxists look at it. And again, even capitalists could be persuaded into saying, yeah, yeah, fine. It's not just a thing. But then the question really is, and what this talk is really about, is what kind of relation is that? What kind of relation is this social relation of production, and between whom? Um, so the big debate is whether or not the relation is good or is bad, right? Defenders of capitalism will say it's good, it's mutually beneficial. They will often say that, okay, they'll admit it might be more beneficial to capitalists, when their wealth goes up, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000%, and our wealth over 50 years goes up 7%. They could still say, look, everybody benefits, right? Just some more than others. Stop being jealous. You're 7% better off than you were 50 years ago. Of course, Marxist economists will look at that and actually take apart that 7% and actually say this is based on the fact that, okay, 20 years ago, a 50-inch screen TV was $10,000. Now it's 500. And that balances out the fact that housing, education, and food are now 4 times as expensive. So stop complaining, right? Um, that's the important economic work that Marxists can do in dismantling um, the capitalist apologetics. So Marx and Marxists take a different approach, that this is not, in fact, a good relationship. It's an exploitative relationship. And this is based on the idea of the labor theory of value, that everything that is produced is actually the product of labor, including the machines that make the products of labor. We make the machines that make the goods. We make the goods that then are sold to make the machine, right? Everything comes from labor. This was not controversial in Marx's day. He was following mainstream economists in his day, like John Locke, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. Um, but since then, capitalists have gone off and decided that it's actually something else that makes value, their own genius, their innovation, and things like that. None of it actually makes sense, and in fact, if you follow the logic, it actually undermines the sustainability of capitalism. Capitalism is an accident if you follow these ideas to their conclusion. Um, so this is why we uh, maintain Marx's idea of the labor theory of value, not because we follow whatever Marx said, but because it's the only rational explanation for how things actually work. Um, a few other things about this relationship that Marx discusses. So it's exploitative. We're paid less than the value of our labor. Um, Two, they're constantly trying to pay the minimum necessary to maintain the worker. Um, This then raises the question of what we call social reproduction. And I'll only be able to get into that a little bit, but I know there's going to be, or I think there's going to be breakout sessions. People can talk about those in the breakout sessions if they want. And then third, related to that, it's constantly trying to de-skill work and replace skilled with unskilled labor and replace high-paid workers with lower-paid workers. And this raises the question of inequality within the working class. Um, and then the final thing, going back to the labor theory of value, one of Marx's key insights was that it's not an individual's labor, it's the generalized labor power that workers have across looking at the entire working class. Okay, so we're at the working class. Who's this relationship between bosses and workers, working class and ruling class? Let's start with the working class. Okay, so the relationship is exploitative, and it's unequal. So this raises another question. Who would do this, right? Why would anybody work for less than the value of their labor? The answer is that no one would, unless they had no alternative. And this is a key point that many Marxists miss. A lot of people talk about the poverty that capitalism creates as being a result of um, uh, the poverty wages that the capitalists pay. This is only partly true. The real engine of poverty is outside the economic sphere in capitalism. Um, Marx loved being sarcastic in his writings, talking about workers being freed to become wage workers. But he usually meant and stressed that this was freed not just from the land or from oppressive laws, but freed from the means of making a living on their own, freed from any access to the means of production. Um, there's towards the end of Capital, Marx if anybody has any doubts about this, at the end of Capital, Volume One, he's remarking about this Australia or a British author talking about Australia and how when Britain was colonizing Australia, so many farmers didn't want to work in factories um, because they had farms, right? And so they also suggest taking these farms away and making them more expensive so that people have to work at least for a time in the factories. And Marx remarks that this author discovered the man compelled to sell himself of his own free will, right? And so that compulsion to sell yourself of your own free will is the irony that Marx is pointing out in capitalist freedom. Um, so capitalism requires that there not be any alternative to itself. Um, uh, and this intolerance of alternatives, and capitalism can't exist if there is an alternative, right? Nobody would work for them, for capitalists if there was, is why you get at the dawn of capitalism this explosion of inquisitions, of genocides, even before the Columbus's voyages to the New World. Um, quote unquote New World. But even in Europe, you get these anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish pogroms. You get the Reconquista in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, and then of course the massive genocides and cultural, uh, popular and cultural genocides in the Americas. Just think of the burning of the Mayan codices and things like that. Um, People think of these as feudal things, right? The Inquisition and all this, but that's not actually what was going on during the so-called Dark Ages in Europe. Think about it this way: it took Christianity about 1,000 years to fully Christianize Europe. But then when capitalism started becoming a thing, it took over entire continents in matters of years. Um, uh, or think of it this way, right? In the popular imagination, who would be more of a threat? The Vikings, savage, tattooed, blah blah blah, or medieval Vikings, or Renaissance merchants. Well, as it turns out in history, the Renaissance merchants were the genocidal ones. And when Vikings came to North America, they set up a farm and then left. Um, Pre-capitalist class societies are often remarkably tolerant compared to capitalism today. Um, so Marx discusses a lot of this in the primitive accumulation of capital. But here's the thing. Luxemburg, years later, noted that that was not just about the primitive accumulation of capital. This was still going on in Luxemburg's day in the 20th century. Um, And so this led her to theorize that capitalism required wiping out pre-capitalist societies, and that when it could only really expand as long as it had pre-capitalist uh, societies to expand into. And once it ran out of other societies to overthrow, it would really hit capitalism would really hit a crisis, and and not be viable anymore. It was an interesting idea, um, and it stressed how capitalism requires this extra economic bloodlust in order to live. Um, but unfortunately, Luxembourg was wrong, right? Even since then, the world is now capitalist many times over. Capital lays waste to entire countries, regions, peoples, because its system relies on having armies of poor and desperate people willing to work long hours for a few scraps of bread. Capitalism keeps creating the problems that it pretends to solve with its meager paying jobs. And this is true on large scales as well as small scales. Um, if you think about not just the big genocidal wars and things like that, but also neoliberal reforms, right? Um, uh, think about the in Europe when they wanted to um, start slashing the social safety net. In Britain, they said, well, we'll start using housing as a commodity like they do in America, and people will get rich. Right? This was Thatcher's idea. People will get rich. We'll have a lot more wealth. Well, 30, 40 years later, what does Britain have? Lots of homeless people, right? They create the problem they pretend to solve. Um, all right. I mentioned social reproduction and inequality within the working class. I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I do want to say that with respect to social reproduction, these theories are still, even though Marxists have given these a lot more attention lately, still under theorized how the working class reproduces itself in capitalist conditions. And I would just throw out there that Marx mentions this, but given the situation in his day where not only men were in the workforce, but women and children as well, right? Think about the mines and the child labor. Uh, so um, uh, he had a certain idea and expectation of what would happen because of what was going on in his day. Um, but I would um, argue for us to be critical of the idea that social reproduction work is unpaid, rather that it's paid. The family wage is paid to the man, right? And then it's then doled out. And this helps, I think, can help explain the particular mania of male dominance and the mania for very strict family norms. Even though the family should be self-organized, right? And that's what the capitalists fear, even though it shouldn't matter to them at all. They fear our own self-organization of our own families. Um, and likewise with inequality within the working class, they're constantly pushing us down into equality, right? Pushing us down, down, down into the kind of the same type of miserable situation, but also within that compressed, miserable layer, also creating differences in order to create even more oppressed and desperate sections. And I think what we're seeing now with ICE and Trump's anti-immigrant hysteria is, right. We all know it's impossible for them to physically remove 12 million people from the American working class. Um, what this is all about is about creating an even more desperate, unequal, lower echelon of workers who are afraid to speak out, who have fewer rights and things like that. So, okay, so we started with this simple relation of production, this social relation of production, and we've seen, far from being a benign economic arrangement for the making of, iPhones and hamburgers, capital is constantly rampaging across the globe, creating poverty and desperation that it needs in order to function. Okay, why? Um, who is this for? And this brings us to the last part, the other side of that. Who's this relationship between? Working class, capitalist class. I do want to make a distinction here. In Marxist literature, they're often called the owners, people who own the means of production, but ownership is a juridical concept. Um, Ownership just means control. And when you focus on ownership, you also miss all this other stuff that I'm arguing that capital relies on. The armies, the state, the regulations, the legal enforcement, the special bodies of armed men, as Marx and Engels put it. So if we understand the working class as not just an individual laborer on their own, but as part of a whole, not just working, but also compared to the armies of desperate people who want work. Um, the same thing is true of capitalists. It's not an individual capitalist; it's a class that we're looking at that controls the whole system. Um, so they control the system, but we do the work. We do the work; they get the benefit. We have no control; they have all of it. Apparently, right? Because of course they depend entirely on us, right? All their power, all their wealth is entirely dependent on what we do. Um, Without them, we would still work. We'd probably work less. We'd do work that was more fulfilling. We would create things that were more beneficial for each other, but we would still work. But without us, capitalists cease to exist entirely, right? Um, so this then leads to the question of why not? Why don't we just get rid of them? Why haven't we gotten rid of them? This raises the question of ideology. And as Marx and Engels argued, the ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. But what are those ideas? Um, and this is an issue that sometimes Marxists have a hard time dealing with. They don't. I don't believe Marxists, or sorry, I don't believe capitalists come up with their own ideas. Um, Instead, what I think they do is they, just like they appropriate our labor and our wealth that we create, and then turn it against us, they also take our ideas and transform them into warped funhouse mirror versions, and then pretend they came up with it and feed it back to us as oppression. Um, because really, if you look across the globe and history, in the history of capitalism, there hasn't been no systematic, consistent ideology of capitalists. You've had liberals, conservatives, reformists, Stalinists, military juntas, monarchists, theocratic dictatorships. There's no rhyme or reason to any of these ruling ideologies. At base, they only have the urge to rule today and the urge to rule tomorrow. That's it. The ideas that they then um, take from our struggles, right? How many times have we heard the American ruling class supports women's rights or civil rights or workers' rights, right? When they fought for hundreds of years, literally, against women's rights and civil rights and workers' rights, right? It's only when those struggles won that they finally said, "Oh yeah, no, that was us all along." Um, they I'm all whenever they do this, I'm reminded of Hannibal Lecter putting the face of one of his victims over him, and pretending that he's somebody else. This is capital in a nutshell on that. Um, Now, their Achilles heel in all this is that they actually believe that they're in control, they're in charge, and they're the necessary ones. They believe the funhouse version that they feed to us. They have to. There's no other way around it for them. They have no choice. This creates a warped version of reality for them. Marx said in a this was a little bit early, so forgive the language that he uses. He was in his 20s when he wrote this, but he was talking about the power of money and the distorting effect it has on the ruling class ideology. He says, when I am rich, he's kind of channeling a rich person here, a ruler. Um, I am ugly, but I can buy for myself the most beautiful of women. Therefore, I'm not ugly. For the effect of ugliness, its deterrent power is nullified by money. I, according to my individual characteristics, am disabled, but money furnishes me with 24 feet. Therefore, I'm not disabled. I am bad, dishonest, unscrupulous, stupid, but money is honored, and so is its possessor, me. Money is the supreme good, therefore its possessor is good. Money, besides, saves me the trouble of being dishonest. I am therefore presumed honest. I am brainless, but money is the real brain of all things, and how then should its possessor be brainless? Besides, he can buy clever people for himself. And is he who has the power over the clever not more clever than the clever? This is the attitude of our ruling class, not just of Trump, although it fits really, really well with him, but all over the world, even the supposed smart ones. They have to believe their own horseshit. In a sense, they have to lobotomize themselves in order to make themselves fit to rule this system, right? They have to make themselves stupid to do so. They're trapped in a fantasy that they created. We are not. And everyone in this Zoom call has a role to play in exposing those who benefit from capitalism and abolishing the social relation and replacing it with a truly human one.